Want to learn how to make your own sweater or cardigan in just a few hours? Now that it's fall, sweaters form a big part of my wardrobe and I definitely plan to sew a few. But even if you're pretty familiar with sewing knits, sweater knits can pose a few problems like unraveling, stretching out, or just being hard to shop for online. Well, after sewing countless sweaters for myself over the last 25 plus years, I'm sharing everything you need to know to buy and sew sweater knits. By the end, you'll feel totally confident making yourself a sweater this season. Plus, I'm going to give you my favorite cardigan pattern for free. You might have heard the term sweater knit when shopping for fabric, but what does it really mean? Usually, fabric stores or manufacturers will use this to label fabrics that look like fabrics that could have been knit by hand. So they often have a lot of texture or fuzziness to them like this. The knit patterns also tend to be open with thicker individual yarns than what you might see in other knits like jersey. They're meant to look and feel just like a classic hand-knitted sweater. Of course, hand knitting a sweater often takes me months. Sewing a sweater can be an afternoon project, which is what makes sweater knits so cool. Sweater knits are created just like other knit fabrics, using a machine that creates loops of yarn that interlock, creating that signature stretch, flexibility, and softness. That's why knits feel so cozy and comfy, so you just want to snuggle up in them. But you may have noticed when you're out shopping that fabrics called sweater knit can look drastically different from each other. So why is that? There are two major things that can affect the look and feel of a sweater knit, and those are 1, the type of yarn that's used, and 2, the stitch pattern the yarn is knit with. There are a lot of options for each of those two things. So let's talk through them so you have a better idea about what to look for when you're shopping. The first that I mentioned is the type of yarn. So in other words, we're talking about the fiber. Sweater knits can be made from a mix of fibers like wool, cotton, polyester, and sometimes blends that include elastane or spandex for extra stretch. The type of yarn affects things like the fabric's weight, the warmth, and the texture. For example, wool and acrylic yarns are popular because they're warm and they're durable, but some people might not like the texture of acrylic. Cotton and rayon blends give you a lighter and more breathable knit, but they might not be as warm as wool. So when you're looking for the right sweater knit, pay attention to the fiber contents. The second thing I mentioned is the stitch pattern. So the stitch pattern plays a big role in how the fabric feels and how it behaves. Dense knit fabrics will behave more like a heavy jersey. Open knits will look more lacy. And depending on the stitch pattern, you can find some really beautiful textures and intricate designs in both dense and open sweater knits. Okay, so that's all fine, but what if you're shopping online? How do you know what the sweater knit you're thinking of buying might actually feel like? That's when it's helpful to know what these different stitch patterns are and how they perform. If you're a knitter, you might recognize some of these terms. Jersey sweater knits are smooth on one side and have a little texture on the other, which makes them lightweight and great for layering. Rib knits have a raised texture and they're super stretchy, giving you a snug fit that holds its shape nicely. I made a whole video on rib knits that I'll link below. You can also find fisherman's rib. This is a thicker ribbed fabric with a deep, squishy texture. It's great for chunky sweaters, sweater vests, and cardigans. Then there are cable knits, which have interwoven patterns that add extra texture and thickness. These are perfect for that classic, chunky sweater look. What I love about cables is that they add a lot of warmth, especially in wool. Jacquard knits have multiple colors of yarn that create complex patterns without carrying yarn across the back. So this makes jacquard fabrics stable and less stretchy, but they often have intricate multicolored designs. A lot of jacquards are also double-sided, which is really fun. Lace knits use open, airy patterns with deliberate holes in the fabric, and this makes them look like hand-knitted lace. Lace sweater knits are great for lightweight, feminine pieces like summer tops, shawls, and decorative sweaters. So those are some really common types of sweater knit, but there's a ton of variety among all of them as well. Okay, now you know the terms that you might see when you're shopping, which is super helpful, but you might still struggle with matching a pattern together with a fabric. So let me give you 3 helpful tips for choosing your fabric. Tip 1 is to think about the styling. If the pattern is more fitted and structured, look for a thicker, tighter knit with minimal stretch. For more drape and a slimmer fit, you want the opposite, thinner knits with more stretch. Tip 2, if your fabric has more or less stretch than what's called for, try going up or down a size or 2 to adjust the fit. Pay attention to the finished garment measurements so you know how much ease is built into the pattern. Use this information to pick a fabric with the best weight and drape for the silhouette that you'd like. Tip 3 is my last tip, and it actually comes from Style Maker Fabrics. They have amazing sweater knits, by the way. You should definitely check them out if you're looking for this kind of fabric. If you're shopping online, it can be really hard to tell what sweater knits actually look like. So look for fabrics where you can see a draped photo of them. If the fabric in the picture looks like it has a lot of folds, especially thicker folds, it means the fabric has a lot of structure. This would be a good choice if you need a more stable or heavier sweater knit. If the picture of the fabric looks more soft and fluid with smaller folds or ripples, It's more lightweight. This would be great for projects that require more drape. Once you have your fabric and you're ready to start cutting, you might think that all you need to do is sew your sweater knit like any other knit fabric, right? But there are 3 pitfalls I want to help you avoid. Those 3 things are 1, shrinkage, 2, fraying, and 3, stretching out. So let's talk about what you can do before you sew to prevent all of these. The first issue is shrinkage. So it's important to pre-wash sweater knits in the same manner that you're going to care for them. Now, if your sweater knit is made with wool or another animal fiber, that's when you have to be extra careful. Recently, I made a really silly mistake and I totally ruined a piece of wool sweater knit by throwing it in the dryer, and I talked about this in a previous video. It came out dense and it was stiff and it was way, way smaller. It looks like felt now, and in fact, that's what this process is called. It's called felting. But assuming you want your sweater knit to look more or less the same as when you bought it, I recommend hand washing and laying flat to dry. To hand wash, gently squeeze soapy water through the fabric until it's saturated. And don't scrub it too much, just allow the knit to soak. Then fill the sink with fresh water and gently squeeze out the suds. Drain the water and repeat until the water is clear and soap-free. Lay the fabric flat to dry. Wool in particular is very prone to stretching out when it's wet, so don't hang it. Now what about issue number 2, fraying? Because sweater knits often have a looser structure, or they might even be lacy with lots of holes, you might want to use wider seam allowances than the typical 3/8 inch you see with most knit patterns. Depending on the looseness of the knit, use a seam allowance of 1/2 inch to a 3/4 inch. Another tip is to mark your notches carefully. Notches are sometimes impossible to see on sweater knits, and you really don't want to cut into the seam allowance more than you have to. So instead, try using chalk or tailor's tacks to make notches. The final issue you might encounter is stretching out, and this is where you might want to add a stabilizer to certain key areas. There are a few ways you can work with stabilizers while you're sewing sweater knits. You can stabilize shoulder seams and waist seams with clear elastic, which is a good idea if your fabric is heavyweight. You can also use stretch mesh when you're working with sweater knits. You can use it to add structure, keep your seams from fraying, and add stability to seams. You can usually find stretch mesh in the lingerie section of the fabric store. The mesh stretches along with your knit fabric, which is better than using a crisp interfacing. Mesh is also light enough to prevent added bulk, and it's nearly invisible if your sweater knit is really lacy. One of my favorite ways to use stretch mesh is when hemming. All I do is sew a strip to the bottom of the hem and then turn and stitch. Oh, and another tip. If you can't find stretch mesh, you might be able to find strips of stretch lace. They're also often in the lingerie section of fabric stores, and they're helpful when you're hemming sweater knits. Now you know all about how to prepare your fabric, but there are still some choices you can make while stitching it together that'll help prevent those 3 issues. Remember, the 3 issues are shrinkage, which we've already taken care of by pre-washing, fraying, and stretching out. To minimize fraying, here's what to do. First, use the correct needle. Ballpoint needles are best for sweater knits. The rounded point penetrates the fabric without puncturing the yarns. When you're picking out a stitch, test the length and width on a swatch first. If your knit is stable and dense, you can use your serger for construction. You can also use a zigzag and finish the edges with another zigzag stitch or with your serger. If your knit is open, lacy, or it has a ton of stretch, use a narrow stretch stitch. Set the length to 2 millimeters and the width to 1.5 millimeters. This narrow zigzag will allow your seams to stretch, preventing them from popping when the sweater's worn. Then you can finish your edges with a serger or another zigzag stitch. As far as keeping your fabric from stretching out while you're sewing, a walking foot is incredibly helpful with sweater knits. It'll help prevent fabric from stretching out of shape when sewing. But what about pressing? Should you press sweater knits? My answer is to minimize pressing if you're using a textured knit, so you don't flatten the fabric's texture with heat and steam. When you need to press, use the tip of the iron on the seam. By now you might be wondering what kinds of projects you can sew in sweater knit, and the answer is a lot. So I'm going to share a few of my personal favorites with you, including my favorite cardigan pattern, which is completely free right now. You can sew a simple crew neck shirt in a sweater knit, and it becomes a really fun layering piece. So this is the Seamwork Astoria sweater. It looks so different in this lacy sweater knit, and I think it'd be really cute over a camisole or even like a sports bra. A long cardigan is also really fun in a sweater knit. So this is the Oslo cardigan, and it looks great in a dense sweater knit like this boucle knit here. And also looks great in a drapey sweater knit like this lacy fabric here. If you like your cardigan to wrap and tie instead, try the floor. It is 2 lengths, so you can pick the one that matches your outfit best. And the longer length would look really nice, I think, over a dress or with a skirt. I also love to use sweater knits for dresses. So the Devon dress has a turtleneck and it has this slightly cocoon shape. This would be really lovely in a medium weight sweater knit that has some drape to it. If you want something really cozy, use a boiled wool or another dense fuzzy sweater knit to make the Jill coat-a-gin. It's such a fun layer to sew. It looks really chic over a dress, or it looks really good with jeans too. So I'm going to show you 3 different versions. This first one is a dense wool knit, very simple. And I made this one here in a lightweight boiled wool. So it leans a little bit more sweater and a little bit less coat. And then this last one I also made is also in a sweater knit, and it has this really cool loop texture to it. So I just feel like an elegant teddy bear when I wear this. So overall, I really prefer the thicker and bulkier knit here that I made rather than this green one. I just think it gives it a more coat-like structure, but really I like both of them. And finally, my favorite cardigan to sew is now free. This is the Seamwork Lisa cardigan, and it's free if you sign up for the Snippets newsletter this fall. So every season I share a new free pattern with newsletter subscribers, and I'll put a link to that below. So you can sign up and you can sew this pattern today if you want. I made Lisa in a heavy cotton ribbed sweater knit, which is from Kira Fashion Fabrics. You might have seen it in my recent video, but I made this to replace an old faded fast fashion sweater that I had, and I absolutely love it. One thing you may have noticed is that I used a different matching fabric to create the cuffs on this cardigan, and I also used it to create the facing so that it's less bulky. Well, there's another kind of fabric that you can use to create that look. And in this next video, you'll learn all about it so you can combine it with a sweater knit to get a really professional finish on any sweater.